When did a feeling of, we need to get out of here immediately, save you? What just seemed like a bad storm has started. My ex then decided to play with the dog out in the backyard in the rain. I got a weird feeling about how strong the winds were, and despite being cold crazy, I told my ex she and the dog needed to go down into the basement for shelter with me. Within 15 minutes, half my roof was gone. Apparently the storm was a derecho, which I'd not even heard about before that. I was getting a beer with a friend and he brought along his friend. When we left, I felt very drunk despite only having 2 drinks. They wanted me to come to their hotel as they were getting ready to go to a concert that night, but I made up the excuse that I needed to get home because I think I left my oven on. My beer was 100% tampered with. My vision felt like I was in a tunnel. I got home in an Uber and immediately threw up and continued to do so for the rest of the night. I made a somewhat late night trip to a convenience store that I knew carried wine. I used to work really odd hours, and sometimes late at night I'd finish my work and want to have a few drinks. As I was getting back to my truck, I saw this young girl who asked if I could give her a ride a few blocks back to her home. It was probably a bad idea to judge a book by its cover, but she was pretty young and dressed decently. Didn't act too weird or anything, so I was like, all right. Well, I'm heading back and we get into a pretty rough part of town and she turns up and says, turn here, very dark street, whatever. I stop and she says she really appreciated the ride and wanted to do something for me. Asked if she could give me a BJ. I decline and start getting sketched out like she needs to get out now. She gets out and closes the door, and as I drive away, 2 men dressed in dark clothing were just stepping towards the street and stared at me as I drove past. Pretty sure that would have ended with a gun in my face. That's what you get for being nice sometimes. A friend and I had just seen a midnight movie. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I pulled up into a gas station to grab a Yoo-hoo. I grabbed the bottle, turned around, and saw 3 men enter the store together. One waited by the doors, one stood near the register looking at chips, and the third was crouched down with his back to the employee door so the cashier wouldn't see him through the square window in the door. They all looked at me at once and then they try to ignore me, acting like they're just casually positioned around the cashier and the door. I woke up, put my Yoo-hoo on the counter. The cashier turns the scanner and basically tells me with my eyes, "You do it." I ring myself up, drop money on the counter, and walk as normally as I could past the man by the door and out to my car at what seemed like the furthest pump from the store. I sit down, throw my Yoo-hoo at my buddy, and hit the emergency button in my car that calls 911. I connect with dispatch and report a possible robbery. A mile or 2 later, I see a cop car flying down the street in the direction we just came. I called non-emergency the next day to ask what happened, and they said the men fled after I left, and the cashier told the police he knew he was about to get robbed too, and to thank me for calling the police. That felt good. What didn't feel good was my buddy, and all his nervousness about what was unfolding as he was listening to me recount everything to dispatch, thought I just gave him a random Yoo-hoo and chugged that thing down like a starving infant with a bottle. I was about 11 or 12 years old at a neighbor's house. The sun had already set. It wasn't completely dark yet, but it was close and there were less light by the second. We were sitting on the lawn because we loved watching the sky turn from day to night, just talking and giggling and carrying on as little girls do. A truck drove up our street, slower than usual, but not suspiciously slow. Still, I felt my guts sink for some reason I didn't understand. A couple minutes later, it passed by again. And then again, after another few minutes, though not quite as slow this time, I was 100% positive it was the same truck. So I watched it drive away and noticed it started slowing down. I told her to get up, and when the truck made another U-turn and started heading towards us again, I told her to run and hide. I don't know if she realized what she was hiding from, but we ended up splitting up in two directions. She drove behind a bush, and I crouched behind an old car parked in the driveway. We could see each other, and I had a clear shot to the door if I needed to dart in to get a parent. But we heard the truck roll up and stop right in front of her house. Someone got out of the truck and started calling for us. I honestly don't remember what they were asking though. We just kept our eyes locked and tried to stay as still and quiet as possible. We probably should have screamed, but I think we were both too scared. The person eventually got in their car and took off. We stayed hidden for what felt like forever, eyes locked, until we finally faced self enough to run inside. I don't know what would have happened if I didn't notice something and we booked it, or if that person was actually dangerous or not, but I'm glad that I will never find out. Not my feelings, but whatever. It was at the Goose Fair in Nottingham in the early 2000s. I was there taking pictures for my art course, and my boyfriend at the time fancied himself as a bit of a hard man. Liked to make out that he was trained or whatever. Anyway, after about 20 minutes, he made me leave. Said that poop was about to go down. Huge eye roll. Whatever, dude. Okay, we'll leave. I see in the news the next day that a 14-year-old girl was shot dead there, not long after we left. I mean, it's all speculation since we didn't actually end up getting kidnapped. But when I was 19 and traveling solo in Europe, I met this Australian girl in Spain who was also around 18, and we went to Italy together. We were both short, petite girls and were very clearly in need of a place to stay. We missed our first ferry out of Barcelona, so we had to take the next one. When we arrived in Italy, our train was hours late, and we didn't get into Rome until around 1 or 2 in the morning. We navigated the sketchy streets by the Termini train station and finally found our hostel. The check-in lobby was a small, dingy room that appeared to be a closet. The man working reception looked us up and down and told us there was no room for us there anymore, since we were late, but suggested that we stay in their sister hostel. Desperate, we agreed. He took us downstairs back to the alleyway where we were greeted by a large man in dirty clothing. They spoke to each other in a language other than English or Italian and led us outside. We walked down a couple alleyways until we got to an unmarked door on the side of a building. One of the men made a phone call, again speaking in a different language. We found it odd since everyone could speak English, but they chose to speak in a language we didn't understand. A man cracked the door open just enough to poke his head outside, and upon seeing the other men fully, opened the door and let us in. We walked down the stairs into the sunken room, which was lit by black lights. At this point, it was me, my friend, and 3 large men. The reception was a dirty room containing a couch with some dirty sheets laid over it. They told us the rooms were in the basement and to follow them. We walked down a set of stairs, one man in front, followed by my friend, followed by another man, behind her, followed by myself, and the last man behind me. We went down one flight of stairs to find that there was yet another flight of stairs going down to a closed door. At this point, I lost it, and my friend and I pushed past the men and scrambled back upstairs. The men kept shouting at us that the rooms were downstairs, but the scenario seemed way too wild. We eventually found an Australian couple on the street who brought us to their expensive hotel where we booked a room. The next day, we searched the internet for the sister hostel they brought us to because we couldn't remember the name they gave us. We found the hostel online, but it was very clear that this wasn't where they brought us. The hostel boasted beautiful views of the city, so clearly a few levels above the ground, and was immaculate. We were definitely in some weird, backlit, dirty basement. We thought for sure that we were going to get kidnapped and sold into the human trade that night. Not me, but my mother. She was on a business trip, taking a taxi from the airport, and she noticed the driver wasn't taking the route usually taken, as she had done this multiple times before. She asked him first out of curiosity. Perhaps there was a road closure or something. The guy simply mumbled something and mostly ignored her. Then it became more apparent they weren't headed towards the hotel and instead away from the center of the city. She got more and more aggressive, eventually demanding he stop, and he kept ignoring and mumbling something. Finally, she got loud enough and threatening enough that he did pull over and got out. She had a cell phone, but smartphones weren't a thing yet. She was able to call a taxi service and get someone else to pick her up. And sure enough, they were headed nowhere near her hotel. Now maybe this guy was hoping he could take an ignorant tourist on a joyride and rack up some high fare, but it sure has the feeling of something far more malicious in the making. I was at a house party in high school and things were getting very rowdy. Tons of people just trashing the place, and I had a bad feeling. Told my friends we should leave, but none of them would listen. I remember going out to my car, and as soon as I got in, the cops pulled up. I ducked down and waited for them to get up to the front door, and then just drove off without them ever noticing. Several of my friends spent the night in jail or hiding in the woods. I slept in my comfortable bed. We were hiking and geocaching in northern Michigan, where it's pretty rednecky in spots. We were at a designated trail with a small parking lot off on some weird side road, but we decided to check it out anyway. About 5 minutes into the trail, we noticed a game camera, but there was no ID on it. Game cameras on public land need to have ID info, and we thought that was really strange. We kept walking a bit, but I just didn't feel right about the camera or walking on this trail. So we turned around and went back to the truck instead of walking the last mile of the trail. When we got back to the truck, this beater pulls up with a couple in it. The guy was just a regular redneck, but the girl in his passenger seat 100% had the nods and was struggling to keep her head up. He looked surprised when we walked out of the trail, and they sat in the lot for a second and then left. Pretty sure they weren't looking to go on for a hike. My guess is that it was their camera and they got the notifications when people are on the trail so that they can break into their cars. It happened to us on a family trip in Kentucky years ago, so maybe I'm just a little suspicious, but we decided no more backwoods hidden nature trails for us. A couple years ago, I was walking home from the bar at 1 in the morning. I'm a young woman in her 20s, so this was instantly stupid. But I wanted to save money avoiding an Uber and was also drunk, so I wasn't thinking straight. I'm walking down a main but dark street, and then a pickup truck drives by slowly, slows down next to me. 2 men look at me and the passenger asks, "Hey, do you need a ride somewhere?" I lie and say no thanks, because I'm expecting one in a moment. They said, "All right," and drove off. I watched them drive down the street, and then a ways down, I saw their brake lights light up. There was no stop sign or stoplight, so I just assumed the worst and thought, I've got to get out of here. I ran into a tiny parking lot to my right and hid behind an outdoor vending machine. Moments later, the 2 men pulled into the lot and circled it, clearly looking for me. When they couldn't find me, they drove away. I waited a few moments until I decided to call an Uber. When I was 17, I used to go jogging early in the mornings. My then BF lived about 7 blocks down the road, so I'd jog to his house, then we'd loop around a park together before heading back to our respective homes. I started noticing a guy sitting in his car in the park, watching us run. After a week of this, I'd see the same guy along my jogging route, close to house, in addition to him being at the park. He'd sit in his car and watch me run, drive to the park, then watch me some more. My boyfriend thought I was being paranoid about all of it. One morning, it was really, really foggy outside. I started to cross the street, and as I was almost across, Someone turned their headlights on bright and it blinded me. Instead of going forward, I stopped and started walking backwards towards my house. As my eyes adjusted, I could see that the man who'd been watching me was standing next to his car with the trunk popped open. I noped out of there and went home. I never jogged there again. I reported it to the police, but they didn't seem to care. 2 years later, a 16-year-old girl was kidnapped, stuffed into a trunk, then driven out to the countryside. She was beaten, violated, and left there naked. By the description of the man in the car, I knew it was done by the same guy who was watching me jog. They never caught him. Up in the woods, about 2 a.m., having a very large bonfire in midwinter. There were probably 7 or 8 feet of snow where it wasn't packed, and my friend and I were the only two sober. After about 45 minutes, we both looked at each other at the same time and went, "Something is wrong." Neither of us could quite explain it because we hadn't seen anything, but we knew there were animals in the woods. Grizzlies, wolves, and bobcats are all known to be there, but generally leave larger groups and fires alone. We managed to convince the roughly 15 drunk guys to head back to the trucks a mile away as a group, knowing at least the sober friend on her had a gun on her and could use it. We got everyone into vehicles and everyone shipped back to town eventually. When the guys who didn't believe us went back out in the morning to check that everything was cleaned up, they found the tracks of a pack of wolves that had been circling the clearing. This was back in 2019. I was in college and there was a really nice guy in one of my classes. A week or two in, we had to work together on a small project, and I was pretty excited about the opportunity to get to know him. After speaking to him, though, I got a really bad vibe from him, but nothing specific that I could put my finger on. I lost all attraction to him and knew that I should keep my distance. He approached me a couple of times after the project, but I made sure to be cool and distant, though still polite. A month or two later, in the same semester, our professor, Mr. Baldwin, announced that the guy had been arrested for murdering a girl he had been dating, another student in our college, and apparently it was an extremely brutal murder. He gave us the number of the detective investigating the case in case we had any information to share. Decided to have a look at a covered stream that I hadn't been down before. We weren't expecting it to be much, so no safety call out, weather check, or even bother to let anyone know where the entrance is. Get about 750 meters in, and my buddy notices a lot of water pouring on up ahead. We look at each other and go, "We need to get out, now." In under 5 minutes, the water went from ankle deep to manageable and knee deep and almost pushing us over. We reached a section with some steps, a ladder, and a handrail, and managed to push the lid off with the water getting deeper every minute. If that ladder had been 10 meters further, we might not have made it. If we'd slipped, dead. When we got out, it was raining gently. We were soaking wet and just looked at each other with that OF look. A bit more above ground exploring, and we worked out that the culvert went under a local canal. If we'd have slipped, we'd have ended up in a sump under a canal and likely never made it out. Nobody knew where we were, what was happening, or how to find us. In all likelihood, the only time they'd know where we died is when our corpses got spat out into the nearby river. A combination of stupidity and stupid good luck, I guess.